Sometime in the late 1960s, a Japanese psychiatrist named Takeo Doi went to visit a colleague in the United States for the first time. He was a guest in an American home, and at some point during the evening, his host turned to him and asked, "Are you hungry? Help yourself to anything in the refrigerator." Takeo Doi froze. He was, in fact, hungry, but he stood there, unable to move toward the refrigerator, unable to simply help himself. He wrote about this moment years later in a book that would go on to become one of the most widely read works of Japanese psychology in the 20th century. What paralyzed him, he realized, wasn't shyness. It wasn't a language barrier. It was something far older than that. He had grown up in a world where love was expressed not through explicit offers, but through the other person anticipating your need before you had to name it. In Japanese, there is a word for this, amai. It roughly translates as the presumption of another's benevolence, the expectation, not the request, that someone who loves you will simply know what you need and provide it without you having to ask. Doi had spent his entire childhood swimming in that assumption. His mother had known when he was cold before he shivered. His father had known when something at school had gone wrong before he'd said a single word at dinner. And now, standing in a kitchen in America, he was being asked to name his own hunger out loud, to reach for his own food, to operate as a self-contained individual. It felt, he wrote, like being handed a freedom he hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. I've been thinking about Takeo Doi a great deal lately, not because most of us grew up in Japan, but because what he was describing, that invisible architecture of expectation and need and unspoken love that we absorb from the people who raised us, is something every single one of us carries. We just don't always have a name for it, and we almost never talk about how much of our adult life is quietly organized around it. That's what this is about. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs specifically to people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's not the exhaustion of overwork, though that's often present too. It's the exhaustion of trying to be one person with your parents and a different person with everyone else. You go home for the holidays, or your mother calls on a Tuesday when you're in the middle of something, or your father says something at dinner that he's been saying in one form or another for the past 30 years. And something happens inside you. A switch flips. You feel yourself getting smaller or getting harder or getting very carefully neutral in a way that requires enormous effort to maintain. And you drive home afterwards, and you think, I'm a grown adult. I have built a life, made decisions, survived things. Why does 20 minutes with them make me feel like I'm 12 years old again? Most people, when they reach this point, try one of a few things. They try distance, physical or emotional. They try the direct conversation, the one that's supposed to clear the air, which sometimes helps and sometimes makes everything worse. They try therapy, which often illuminates the patterns without quite dissolving them. And underneath all of these attempts, there is a question that most people can't quite bring themselves to ask directly because it feels either too small or too enormous. The question is this: who are you, actually, when you take off the self you learn to become in that house? Buddhism has been sitting with this question for 2,500 years, and what it found is stranger and more useful than most of what the modern world has to offer on the subject. The word the Buddhist tradition uses is samskara. It comes from Sanskrit and it means impressions, imprints, the residue left behind by experience. Think of it like this. When water flows over rock for long enough, it doesn't just pass over the surface. It carves channels, grooves in the stone that guide where the next water will flow, and the water after that, and the water for centuries to come. The stone looks solid from the outside, but it has been shaped all the way down by what moved through it. That's a samskara, not a memory exactly, not a belief you consciously hold, but a groove, a carved channel in the self that quietly determines which way your emotional water flows when pressure arrives. The samskaras that form earliest in life are the ones that run deepest, and the earliest ones are almost entirely about your parents, not because your parents were necessarily cruel or careless or even particularly flawed. They may have loved you well by any objective measure, but they were the entire world when you were small. They were the first evidence you had about whether the world was safe or dangerous, whether you were wanted or burdensome, whether love was something given freely or something that had to be earned by being a particular kind of person, and whatever conclusions your nervous system drew from that evidence. Before you had language, before you could reason, before you were capable of questioning any of it, those conclusions became channels. They became the grooves through which your adult emotional life still tends to flow, whether you want it to or not. The psychologist Daniel Stern spent decades studying the first 2 years of human life, and what he documented was this: infants don't experience events as events. They experience them as patterns. The way your mother's face looked when she picked you up, the quality of attention when you cried. Was it immediate, delayed, anxious, distracted? The specific texture of safety or its absence in the hours between sleeping and waking? These repeated patterns become what Stern called representations of interactions that have been generalized. Rigs, he named them. They are the templates your brain builds from thousands of small, repeated moments. Templates that then run silently in the background of every close relationship you will have for the rest of your life. Buddhism calls them samskaras. Western developmental psychology calls them attachment patterns. They are, at bottom, the same thing. Channels carved by early water, shaping where all the later water goes. But before we go there, there's a specific feature of samskaras that's worth understanding properly, because it changes what's actually possible. Samskaras are not memories in the usual sense. A memory you can revisit, examine, recontextualize. You can say, I remember that happened, and now I understand it differently. A samskara is older than memory. It operates below the threshold of recollection. You don't remember the first time your father's voice went cold with disappointment. You were 18 months old. There was no verbal encoding, no narrative stored. But your body remembers. Your nervous system built a response, a specific quality of vigilance, a particular readiness to scan for disapproval that has been running quietly in the background ever since. This is what the neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux documented in his research on fear conditioning. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes emotional memory, stores certain kinds of experience not as narrative, but as physical reflex, a sound, a smell, a particular quality of silence in a room. Any of these can trigger a response that is faster than conscious thought, faster than the part of you that knows you are a grown adult who is no longer in that house. Ledoux called this the low road, the neural pathway that bypasses the thinking brain entirely and produces the response before the cortex has had time to weigh in. Buddhism arrived at the same understanding through a completely different route and called it the arising of samskara, the moment when the groove catches the water before you even knew the water was moving. This is why intellectual understanding of your family patterns, and you may have enormous intellectual understanding, doesn't automatically change how you feel when your mother uses that particular tone of voice. You're not failing to apply what you know. Your body is operating on a system that was built before knowing was even possible. The samskaras you carry are not only yours. Your mother carried impressions carved by her mother. Her mother carried impressions carved by hers. The nervousness your father brought to the dinner table did not originate with him. It arrived in him, from somewhere, from someone who scared him once or many times when he was too small to understand or escape. Buddhism formalizes this through the concept of pratityasamutpada, dependent origination, the teaching that nothing arises from nothing. Every present moment is a continuation of the one before it. Every wound has a wound behind it. This is not a comforting idea. It can feel, when you first really sit with it, like being told that the thing you're carrying was already waiting for you before you were born. In some ways, that's exactly right. The German psychotherapist Bert Hellinger spent 40 years working with what he called family constellations, a therapeutic practice based on the observation that certain patterns, certain kinds of suffering, certain ways of relating to love and loss and authority repeat across generations in ways that are too consistent to be coincidence. He was working from a different framework than Buddhism, but he arrived at the same basic insight. We do not only inherit the features of our parents' faces, we inherit the shape of their unfinished business, the grief they never processed, the anger they had no permission to express, the longing they dismissed in themselves as impractical or embarrassing or simply too late. These things don't disappear when they're suppressed. They find new containers. They show up in the next generation, wearing different clothes in different circumstances attached to different stories. There's a specific pattern Hellinger observed that keeps appearing across families, cultures, and generations. A grandfather who went through something devastating, a war, a loss, a profound humiliation, and who never spoke of it, who decided, as people of that generation often did, that the appropriate response to unspeakable things was to simply not speak of them. His son grows up knowing something happened, but not what. Knowing there is a closed room in his father, but not what it contains. And the son carries a free-floating anxiety that he can't quite attach to anything. An unnamed heaviness, a tendency toward a particular kind of vigilance. His daughter, your mother, let's say, inherits this heaviness without inheriting its story. She knows only that something in the family feels dense and unspoken, and she passes it to you, not through words, but through the quality of her nervous system, the way she tenses at certain things, the topics she skirts around without seeming to notice she's skirting, the specific texture of how love was given and withheld in the house you grew up in. You arrive at adulthood carrying a weight whose origin is 2 generations back, and no amount of therapy, no matter how insightful, can give you memories of something you never witnessed. Buddhism's response to this is not despair. It is something more precise than that. Pratityasamutpada, dependent origination, teaches not only that everything arises from conditions, it teaches that conditions can change. The channel was carved by water. New water carves new channels, not quickly, not without resistance. But the stone is not permanent. Nothing is permanent. That is, after all, the oldest Buddhist teaching of all, which means that what was passed to you does not have to be passed forward unchanged. The chain can be interrupted, not by understanding it, by something that flows through the channel differently, repeatedly, over time. There is a Zen story, brief, without any named teacher attached to it, about a student who comes to the master and says, "I have been meditating for 3 years on my anger toward my father. I understand now where it comes from. I can trace its roots all the way back. I see the whole pattern clearly." And the master says, "Good, now stop understanding it and feel it." The student doesn't know what to say. The master continues, "Understanding the channel does not change the channel. Only something flowing through it can change it. The channel was not carved by understanding. It was carved by experience, and it can only be recarved by new experience. Repeated, slowly, in the body, not just in the mind." There is something that needs to be said plainly here, because I've noticed that conversations about parental wounds tend to drift toward one of two extremes. Either the conversation slides into excuse-making, they did their best, they were wounded too, have compassion, in a way that papers over real damage that was genuinely done, or it slides into blame and stays there, parked permanently at the intersection of what they did wrong and what you deserved instead. Buddhism doesn't ask you to do either of these things. It asks something harder. And before I say what that is, I want to name something that doesn't get named enough. Some of what happened to you in that house was not okay. Not all parental wounding is the quiet, structural kind. The unconscious transmission of unprocessed grief, the unintentional replication of patterns. Some of it was chosen, some of it was cruel. Some of it was a parent who knew on some level that what they were doing was causing damage and did it anyway. The Buddhist framework of samskara and dependent origination does not excuse this. Sometimes people are not doing the best they can. Sometimes the best they can is still genuinely harmful. And sometimes they weren't even trying. Seeing your parents within the chain of conditions that shaped them is not the same as absolving them. It is possible, and this is the difficult thing, to hold both of the following simultaneously. What you did caused real damage, and you arrived at this relationship already carrying channels that were carved before I was born. Both of these are true. One does not cancel the other. The Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa, controversial in many respects, but precise about this particular thing, used the phrase idiot compassion to describe the compassion that is really just conflict avoidance. The kind that says, "I understand you, I forgive you," while quietly not being honest about what actually happened. He distinguished it from what he called clear compassion. Clear compassion can look someone in the eye and say, "What you did caused damage. I am not going to pretend otherwise. And also, I can see that you were doing the only thing you knew how to do with the channels you had." Both of these things are true at the same time. The damage was real. The limitations were real. Holding both simultaneously is not a comfortable position, but it is an honest one. And it is the only position from which anything like genuine freedom becomes possible. If you're in your 40s or 50s and you've been carrying something about your parents for a long time, a complicated grief, a persistent anger, an ache that doesn't quite have a name, you may have already made a kind of peace with it, a practical peace. The kind where you've reorganized your life to minimize the friction, where you've built enough distance or enough coping that it doesn't disrupt your daily functioning. And someone might ask you sincerely, have you worked through the stuff with your parents? And you'd say, yes, mostly, and it would be true. But there's a specific thing I want to say to the person for whom mostly carries a lot of weight, for whom there's still that moment, a phone call, a visit, a photograph, a particular smell, when something older than your adult self surfaces briefly, and you feel the channel run through you before you've had a chance to choose otherwise. Something else needs to be named here too. For some of you, the relationship with your parents is no longer possible in the usual sense. They may have died, or they may still be alive, but the distance, physical, emotional, the kind made necessary by the need to protect yourself, has made something permanent of the separation. And there is a particular quality of grief that belongs specifically to this, the grief of a relationship that will never be resolved in the way you once hoped it might be, the conversation that can no longer happen, the acknowledgement that is no longer possible to receive, the version of them you needed as a child that no longer exists, if it ever did. What Buddhism offers instead is something different, not closure, but completion, the recognition that this relationship, exactly as it was, with all of its damage and its love and its unspoken things, is complete, not finished, complete. Completion is the willingness to let that be what it was, without requiring it to become something else before you can put it down. The Buddhist understanding of samskara is not that these channels can be completely erased. The grooves carved earliest run too deep for that. What changes is your relationship to the channel. There's a difference between being the water, flowing automatically through the groove, carried by momentum without awareness, and being something that can notice the groove and choose, in that moment, whether to follow it. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki, who taught in California until his death in 1971, said something that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. He said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." The person who has spent 40 years being a particular kind of person with their parents, who knows the exact choreography of every argument, who can predict with almost perfect accuracy what will be said and how it will land, that person has become an expert. And experts stop seeing possibilities. The practice, and I mean this as a practice, something you do repeatedly in small moments, not a single dramatic conversation, is to return again and again to a beginner's mind in that relationship. To sit across from your father at dinner and notice the expert in you who is already composing the response to something he hasn't said yet. And ask, what would I notice about this person if I were meeting him for the first time? Not to perform freshness, not to pretend the history isn't there, but to let, just briefly, just in one moment, the channel show you that it is a channel, and not the only possible way. The one thing I'd like to leave with you isn't something to say to your parents. It isn't a conversation to have, or a letter to write, or a confrontation to finally attempt. It's smaller than any of that. The next time you're in that space, before a phone call or after one, or sitting across from them at a table, or alone with a memory that arrived uninvited, notice what happens in your body in the moment before the switch flips, not after, before. There's a moment, very brief, easy to miss, when something in you recognizes the groove and begins to lean into it. It might feel like a slight tightening across the chest, a particular quality of readiness, like something bracing for impact, a familiar dimming of a certain kind of hope. Whatever its texture is for you, that signal is not the wound. That moment is you, noticing the channel. And in the space between the signal and the automatic response, even if that space is only 2 seconds long, you are something more than the water. You are the person who can see the water moving. That's the beginning, not the resolution, not the healing, just the beginning of being able to see what has always been there, moving through you before you had any say in the matter. And once you can see it, once the channel becomes visible rather than just inevitable, you begin slowly to have a choice about it. Not every time. Not without slipping back into the groove 100 more times. But the possibility of choice is there. And possibility is where everything begins. Takeo Doi, standing in that kitchen in America, unable to reach for his own food. He didn't understand in that moment that he was standing at the edge of his own samskara. He only knew he was paralyzed by something he couldn't name. Understanding came later. The writing came later. The decades of sitting with the question came later. And even at the end of his long career, he did not claim to have resolved it. He only claimed to have understood what was there. That's not a small thing. In a relationship as old and as deep as the one with the people who made you, seeing clearly is everything. If what we've talked about today touched something that's been quiet for a while, don't rush past it. These things take time to move from the place where you understand them to the place where you can actually feel them. Sometimes years. And that is exactly as it should be. Next time, we're going to look at something that grows directly out of this. The person you keep becoming in every relationship. Not just with your parents, but with partners, with friends, with anyone who gets close enough. The Buddhist concept of vasana, the deep habit impressions that were carved before you were old enough to choose them, and what it actually takes psychologically and spiritually to begin to change them. That one goes deeper still. I'll see you there. And if this has been worth your time, if something in it named what you've been carrying, the simplest thing you can do is stay. There's more of this to come.